Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today. How are things in San Francisco?
A little foggy, but otherwise lovely.
So, I am very much looking forward to this discussion and doing a deep dive on your recent book, Apple in China. And before we do that, why don't we just start with a brief overview of your book for our viewers? And maybe you can also tell us what was the impetus behind writing it.
This is a little bit of a cute answer, but when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007, you'll remember he introduced it as three products, right? And it was three products rolled into one. I sort of do the same thing for my book. So on the one hand, I'm trying to tell the definitive history of Apple from the near bankruptcy in 1996, all the way to world's most valuable company. And weirdly, that story has not been told. Like you'd think there's probably a dozen books on it. Well, name me the book. I mean, it hasn't been written. We know Apple through biographies of people like Steve Jobs, of course, Tim Cook, and Johnny Ive, but no one's actually just written sort of a history just of that story, which is a little bit incredible. Even if you focus just on the products, as people are wont to do, that history doesn't exist. So I wanted to do that. Secondly, I wanted to take a look at the manufacturing strategy that they had. And I guess the sort of simplistic way of saying this is that, Apple is founded by two Steves in a garage in 1976. Manufacturing is in their DNA, it's in their ethos. The electronic supply chain doesn't really exist in the late 1970s. The personal computer barely exists. And so when they eventually move to offshoring, they only do so in a way where they are maintaining control. I should have said outsourcing rather than offshoring, but it's both. And so understanding how Apple comes up with a model of we are going to orchestrate production rather than manufacture ourselves, but we're going to have such maniacal control over the processes. It's like we own it ourselves. That seemed totally fundamental to me. And then the third thing is like when they go on that journey, they of course find China. They're late to the party, as it were. Everybody's in China. But in the same way that they're late to MP3 players, but they build the iPod, they're late to smartphones, but they build the smartphone. They're late to China, but they build the world's most sophisticated supply chain. And how they do that in China, what it takes to have government relationships in China, was itself an untold story. So those three things into one, packaged into one book, that was the big pitch. And it really went very well. I mean, I would sort of say none of those three stories should be able to be told in the sort of novel detail that I tell them in, because we're talking about the world's most valuable company. I mean, it's absolutely iconic, and it's got at least six blogs. There are at least six blogs that just cover Apple. Places like the New York Times have an Apple reporter, right? Like this should not be a company where you're just like unveiling secrets year after year about what's going on with the company. And yet through all three of those narratives, I think the book delivers on doing just that.
Great overview. And Apple truly is iconic. And I spend a lot of time speaking with people on economics, politics, and investing. And I want to hit on all of these elements as they pertain to Apple. Everyone is aware of Apple, but they might not be fully aware of truly how successful it is. And when you look at the numbers with regard to Apple, they're truly staggering. And I want to throw out a few numbers just for the benefit of our viewers. Apple had revenues of 391 billion in 2024, and to put that into further perspective, Apple's revenues exceeded the revenues of Netflix, McDonald's, and Starbucks combined. I love this next stat, Patrick. Apple's market cap of $3 trillion is equal to the entire market cap of the Toronto Stock Exchange, which is comprised of 1,600 companies. Apple sold over 230 million iPhones in 2024 alone. 53% of those were sold in the US. The second largest market for Apple is in China. Approximately 18% of their iPhones were sold there. And many people might not be aware of this, but 80% or more than 80% of Apple's products, including their iPhones, are made in China. And maybe you can tell us why this is and why they're made in China and why not in the US or some other Asian country.
So the narrative I have is that in the late 1990s, Apple is really on the back foot. They are days away from filing for bankruptcy. This is before the comeback of Steve Jobs. And in a sense, the reason they are there is very much a manufacturing story. If you remember, the Mac OS is really 10 years ahead of its time when it comes out in 1984. But IBM and the PC clones that mimic the IBM, they do something entirely different. And Steve Jobs doesn't understand this and when he dissects the computer in, I think, August 1981, which is that the IBM PC is almost bandaged together from off the shelf parts. And if you're Steve Jobs, there's nothing special here, right? This is not about the user experience, but it's not about the graphical user interface. He was worried that IBM was going to come out with some technology that Apple just couldn't afford to mimic. And instead, he looks at it and thinks this is a piece of junk. I mean, arrogantly puts out an ad in a number of newspapers basically declaring, like, welcome to the party, IBM, like, good luck, because this product's no good kind of thing is the subtext. But what happens is IBM has very much launched a war on bringing the price of the computer down. And by having off-the-shelf components, it sort of allows for electronics globalization, whereby a bunch of factories in Asia, particularly in places like Taiwan, can compete for building all those parts. And once they have economies of scale, because everybody mimics the PC and it becomes 95% of the market, they do have this dramatic success in bringing the cost down. And so, anyone our age will remember the catalogs coming out month after month with better specs and lower prices throughout the 1990s. Well, the problem is Apple is not able to keep up with that manufacturing, that distribution, that production. And so by 1996, once Windows 95 is coming out, there's nothing special about the Mac anymore, and they're about to go bankrupt. So they have to adopt a global outsourcing strategy for the first time in 1996. This means that they sell their factory in Colorado, Fountain, Colorado, and they have to raise some money in bonds. And they realize they need a new operating system, which is why the CEO at the time brings back Steve Jobs. And they're off to the races to build the next computer when Steve Jobs comes back. And that's the translucent iMac that people might remember. I had one in Calgary, Alberta in the late 1990s. Phenomenal computer. But how to build it is the big question. And the first major narrative in the book, I would say, is called Unmanufacturable. And it's that Johnny Ive's design is just not possible to be made by the product design team at Apple, let alone building it at scale. And so the story really gets you into the manufacturing DNA of the company right away because they need to build this thing, and yet nobody in the world is capable of doing it. And it's that experience that basically leads them to Korea, where the computer ends up being built by LG. And then when LG does a really good job, they're asked to expand. This is a great strategy in terms of like LG expanding to two other continents, but it ends up being a disaster. They basically have major problems trying to build it in Mexico, major problems trying to do it in Wales. And this actually gives way to a very important phone call in the book where the founder of Foxconn, Terry Guo, calls up a newly hired senior vice president of operations by the name of Tim Cook and says, "Give me a chance. I'll fix this problem for you." That would be the very basics of sort of where the book begins and why manufacturing is so fundamental.
So China is the second largest economy in the world, representing 20% of global GDP. And China's economy has been under pressure in the last few years. It's still growing at 4 to 5%, but no longer at double digits that we saw in previous years. And if you look at any international company that operates in China, they've all suffered serious setbacks in terms of revenue growth. How will a weak China economy impact Apple's operations going forward?
That's a good question. I mean, honestly, I don't know that it will because I'll put it in a couple ways. One, there have been several different failures of policy over the last, let's say, decade in China. Made in China 2025 is not one of them. This is the 2015 ambitious plan for China to, in a sense, vertically integrate, sever itself from the West, and become as self-sufficient as possible in robotics, automation, even things like pharmaceuticals. And I argue, really, I just demonstrate that Apple ends up being the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025. This is very much like the part five, part six of the book. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. But, insofar as China's economy is weakening, it's things that have nothing to do with Apple. And I don't know why there would be collateral damage, which is to say they're building, ghost cities, right? Like their economy is very dependent, even more than on manufacturing, than on real estate development, right? On building, on construction. So if that slows down, that's a problem for China writ large. I don't know why that's a problem for, the automation of the factories or getting migrant labor to the factories. So I don't know that that would really impact Apple. I mean, obviously, you could think of second order, third order impacts where if China's economy is struggling, maybe that causes Xi Jinping and others to think in a different way, to look in a different way. But that'd be way above my pay grade as to how that would play out. I don't think anybody would really know that.
Well, let me attack it from another angle then. Apple's sales in China peaked at 18% in 2023. And now that number is closer to 17%, maybe a little bit lower. But do you think this trend continues? And does this have more to do with a slowing Chinese economy, or does it have to do with something else?
Yeah, I just want to be clear. You're talking about China, like the iPhone market share within China, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so basically, roughly 1 out of 5 smartphones sold in China are iPhones. As recently as 2019, I believe that figure was only 9%. And there is this sense that the current percent share that Apple has is artificially inflated. And what I mean by that is the reason why it jumped from 9% to 17 or 18% is that Huawei was kneecapped by 1.0. So Huawei, if listeners aren't familiar, I mean it's many things. You could call it China's Apple. At the same time, it's China's Qualcomm and it's China's Ericsson really rolled into one. So they don't just build smartphones; they build entire, towers that do chip communication and telecom communication. So really sophisticated company, very very often called China's national champion. Um, they outsold the iPhone in 2019, not just in China, but globally. And the response, in a sense, from Washington was to declare Huawei a national security threat and deprive them of US made technology, particularly 5G chips and Google services. This causes such a calamity at Huawei that they lose $30 billion in a single year, and they have to hive off assets like the sub brand Honor. Now they are back with an absolute vengeance. And I would worry about what Apple's market share in China was going to be because when they fall apart, they are the only company at the time competing with Apple, not just in general, but in the premium tier. So, in other words, if it's 2019, you're Chinese and you want the greatest phone, very good chance that on specs alone, let alone national sentiment, you're buying a Huawei. Once they're deprived of 5G technology, that is not the case. And certainly, Huawei's international business does very poorly once they no longer have Google services. I had a Huawei in the late 2010s living in Germany. I wouldn't have bought one in the early 2020s because it no longer had the Play Store. But now Huawei's back with a vengeance. They've built their own operating system really out of necessity. So the 1.0 policy of going hard after Huawei because, what's this phrase? If you go after the king, you better kill him, something like that. I mean, they went after Huawei. They did not kill Huawei. So Huawei is now back, stronger than ever. Its chip designs are unfortunately phenomenal. Its execution is phenomenal. And I would guess, this is just a guess, I don't know this, that Harmony OS, the new competitor to Android and iOS, will become the de facto standard for all Chinese smartphone brands by 2030.
Wow. So that's an interesting point for a couple of reasons. First of all, can you buy that phone in North America?
You definitely can't buy it in the United States. I don't know about Canada. You might have a sense. And I don't know about Mexico. My guess is, well, even if you can, it's not going to run the sort of fully independent, severed from Android version of Harmony OS. There are different versions of Harmony OS. So it's possible that you can. It's still quite a different phone than what you would buy in China. But on the whole, it is difficult to buy certain Chinese brands in various markets, and I'm not totally up to speed on whether you can be in Chihuahua and purchase one.
So the other point I want to clarify is you mentioned or you suggested that Apple sales in China are not as high as we are led to believe they are. And this is significant because 51% of Apple's revenues come from the iPhone. Um, any thoughts on that? And when do we see a real number? Like if it's not 18%, I think you mentioned you thought it was 9%?
Yeah, so just to clarify, I'm not saying that it's not as the line you said not as high as we're led to believe. I'm not that sounds like there's an accounting fraud. I wasn't saying anything like that. I was saying in 2019 their share had fallen to around 9%. When Huawei gets kneecapped, Apple is the company that capitalizes on that, and that's why you've seen their share double in the last couple of years. Now that Huawei is back and the Chinese are very much buying the new Huawei phones, I have a suspicion that Apple's share will fall back down. Now, maybe it falls to 12%, maybe it falls to 9%, but there's a sense in which I don't think we're going to maintain the level that was sort of artificially inflated by Huawei being taken out of the market. Um, Huawei is just a very important company, and so if they're making good phones, the Chinese will buy them. The other thing, not to get us too off track, is that, the defining feature for anyone, but I think especially in China because their consumers are especially savvy and like this kind of stuff, is AI. Apple is totally on the back foot with AI. I mean, Siri is just not a good product anymore. It might have been innovative 14 years ago, has not kept up. Siri today is not even really much different from what came out in 2011 in a remarkable way. And in America, that doesn't matter so much. I mean, I've literally displaced Siri on my own phone with ChatGPT using the action button, right? Just have a shortcut to him. Never talk to Siri ever. I'm always using ChatGPT. Trouble is, if I'm in China, I can't do that. ChatGPT is illegal in the country. So Apple has to work with someone local like Baidu and Alibaba, and yet it has not actually inked a deal to do so. And so until they've done something like that, I think it's very likely that smart Chinese buyers, the ones that want the luxury products, are going to purchase something from Huawei, from Xiaomi, from Oppo, because the AI is more integrated into the operating system. And the only way that Apple could really match them on that is by working ridiculously closely with the likes of Baidu and Alibaba. And that raises, quite frankly, national security concerns if you're someone in Washington. I mean, it's not a great idea that, and we'll get into this, my narrative is about Apple training Chinese engineers on hardware engineering over the last 25 years. If the next 25 years of success of Apple is then based on sending their software engineers over to China and training them on the next AI technologies, that's a worrying prospect.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on Siri. I can't believe how bad it is. Here it is, it's 2025 and they still haven't figured that out. Even my kids are losing their minds over it. Uh, and I think when they came out with Apple Intelligence, was it last year? I don't even think
Well,
that's been too well received.
yes. No, it hasn't been well received at all. I mean, to the point of lawsuits and ads that have had to be taken down from YouTube because Apple is defensive about this, but in ways that are just ridiculous. Like when they've issued an apology, that they should just stick with the apology rather than the defensiveness, because they would claim that a bunch of AI features really do exist on the iPhone, and they do, but none of them are good. The things that were really exciting about the advanced Siri was that, and this is why one could be bullish about their prospects, even though Apple's clearly behind in AI, because they own the hardware and the operating system. Siri, in theory, has access to a whole host of data that is never going to be available to ChatGPT or anybody else. In other words, if I want to ask questions about the world, ChatGPT is the best thing that will answer on my behalf, or sorry, that will answer those queries. If I want to say, go into that email where James offered me a deal on a subscription package or whatever that was 6 months ago, and then remind me where his office is. And you know what? Book me a flight to go do it. Siri, in theory, could act as an agent, going through my emails, finding out what that is, going to my preferred airline, and booking the flight or something. ChatGPT will never be allowed to do that because that's all proprietary information. To Siri, that's all accessible. So as behind as Apple is, they actually have this enormous advantage that if they're able to get their you know what together, they do have a big advantage. So it's worth knowing that because you can't be too bearish about Apple's AI prospects without knowing that they have these tremendous advantages in pocket.
Well, my son keeps telling me the iPhone 17 is the one that I have to get. My iPhone that I have right now, I think it's the 8. I bought it in
Oh my
20.
gosh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, the crazy thing about that though is that, the differences are a lot more subtle than they would have been if you were going from, let's say, the 3G to the 8, versus the 8 to the 16. You don't have 5G, so that's the main thing in terms of like high quality video content on demand and stuff. But of course, you're using the same apps. I mean, you're probably using Spotify and Audible and Photos apps and things like that. I guess I would be able to do so in a little bit of quicker way, but it's not incredibly dramatic. 5G is the biggest thing you're missing. And I suppose the cameras have improved a hell of a lot, and you're probably charging your phone a lot more than I am. But, if that doesn't bother you, then there's not really a sense to upgrade. At this point, I think you probably should upgrade. If you had the 11, I'd say that's okay, but the 8 is pretty old at this point.
No, I would agree. The lithium ion battery, that's the biggest issue. It might last 3 or 4 hours depending on how much I use it. And the other thing is the camera. I notice a significant improvement when I look at a higher grade phone. The camera and the
Can I
back.
just put the question to you? Why haven't you upgraded? What doesn't, why don't you go to the Apple Store today and buy a 16?
No need to. And the cost. Like I'm thinking, why do I got to drop $1,500 for a new iPhone when the changes are very subtle?
Hmm. Yeah, I finance it, so I pay a monthly fee, and in the context of how expensive San Francisco is, my iPhone bill isn't in the top tier of anything I think about.
Yeah. Well, as you know, in Canada, the prices associated with cell phones and the cellular service are significantly higher than the US. So
Right.
I'm hoping we get some competition from the US
Okay.
telcos here. So we can't have a discussion on China and Apple and the US without talking about the trade wars that are happening right now. between China and the US. There are negotiations going on as we speak, so it changes so often. I'm not even sure where they stand right now. But I want to ask you, what are the ramifications for Apple if tariffs are imposed on their products? And maybe you can also tell me if there's currently tariffs on any Apple products right now.
Gosh, it really is a fast-moving thing, and I've sort of tried to given up on trying to figure out where it all is. I forget exactly what was announced because, at some point we were at 145% tariffs on everything coming from China, but then the 125% of it sort of got taken off as a temporary reprieve during negotiations. So I think we've got a 20% tariffs because of the problem. That was sort of like a standard, not part of other negotiations on the products. But then you also had a 25% iPhone specific product tariff, and I don't believe that goes into effect until the end of this month, if memory serves. So there must be a 20% tariff right now. Then what's more concerning is that Apple is sort of having their plans short-circuited, which is to say that if announces tariffs on China, Apple says, okay, fine, let's have everything assembled in India that we're going to export to the US. This is more hype than substance. Like it really is just a tariff reduction move. So if there are 1,000 components, I'm sorry, if there are 1,000 steps in making an iPhone and the final one is now done in India, I'm not saying that's not consequential at all, but the phone that comes out of India is no less dependent on the China-centric supply chain than any other phone. And so if you understand how complex and deep and wide the China supply chain is, then you would realize that having a phone, quote unquote, made in India doesn't really live up to the name. For tariff law, all you need to have is, quote unquote, a substantive change to the product. So if you get a sub-assembled phone imported from China and then you just do the final step in India, it can say made in India. It's not actually that big of a deal. The trouble is on Liberation Day, I think that was what, April 4th, also announced heavy tariffs on Vietnam and India. In other words, the two places where Apple's been trying to quote unquote diversify to get around these tariffs. I think that's a bit of a disaster as a strategy. The only reason you would have that as a strategy is if you really believe that iPhones can be made in Pittsburgh. I don't think that's at all likely. And so instead of reshoring, the US should be promoting nearshoring, which means the orders go to Mexico or India. And you got to take the win that at least it's not in China. And that's sort of a nice compromise. Like, yes, it'd be better if they were in the United States, but for a host of reasons, that's a total fantasy. It's just not going to happen. And so I would love to see more investments in India. Um, but this is where you just get into some of the complexities and nuance of the book, which is that Beijing has so much control over so many things in their economy, and this is the benefit of an authoritarian economy. If Apple really tries to make accelerated moves anywhere outside of China, Beijing can do any number of things to make sure that doesn't happen. And they have done a few things, right? So you need a bunch of Chinese people that have the experiential know-how flying over to India to set up the production lines. Well, Beijing's just blocked their visas. You need a bunch of Chinese-made machinery that goes on the production line in India if you're going to ramp up. Well, Beijing has just blocked the export of those. So that's what makes Apple captured, right? That's where the subtitle of the book is, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. There is no great strategic move for Apple to make here, particularly because I'm only giving you the geopolitical things where it's difficult for New Delhi, it's difficult for Washington, it's difficult for Beijing to really come to an agreement here. But in addition to all of that, Apple can't say farewell to a business in China that is $70 billion of revenue a year. I mean, you need to understand that that's more than 10 times what Hollywood makes in China. Like, they're not just bigger than other companies, they're bigger than entire industries that operate in China. And I don't have much faith, and I would love to be wrong about this, in India replicating the depth and breadth of the supply chain that you have in China for a host of reasons. Some of them are governmental, some of them are cultural, some of them, there's just so many reasons. But like, for instance, even if Apple said, damn it, we're just going to spend the tens of billions ourselves and build the factories, great. Who's building the 8-lane highways from the factory to the port? Because in China, that gets done. In India, unfortunately, it doesn't. So I'm listing way too many reasons here, but the fact is like there's another 10, there's another 15. There are so many reasons why it's going to be tough to outsource to another country besides besides China, because China is just so sophisticated in this stuff.
Well, you touched on a lot of interesting points there. One of them, you talked about this authoritarian government and I guess the powers that you can have when you have an authoritarian government, one of which is creating policy and directing everyone toward this one policy. And we've seen them do that in so many industries. And I can't help but think of EVs and the lithium ion batteries. If you are an OEM and you need a lithium ion battery, you have to go to China. They control 80% of that market. And they were working on that 20 years ago when no one else was. And during that time period, they were able to refine lithium refining. They were able to work on battery chemistries and determine what metals work better together. And now they dominate that industry. And it sounds like they've done the same thing with iPhones and other phones. But you also touched on onshoring, and we've seen a big push toward this in the US ever since the pandemic because we realized how we how much we are in the West, we're reliant on these countries like China for the lithium ion battery or like Taiwan for the advanced semiconductor. Do you think it's possible for the US to onshore the manufacturing of iPhones?
In a word, no. It is possible that you will see some sort of press release where Apple is pledging to do just that. I don't think there will be much substance behind it, but one could understand that Tim Cook is under such political pressure that one way to sort of give a win is to say certain iPhones are going to be manufactured in the US. But it would be like the iPhones made in India, where they're not really being made there, but they're being assembled there, and so the box can say so. But let's go through a couple reasons why it's just not going to happen. The secret sauce, if you will, of China is what's called the floating population or the dispatch labor system. So in China, there's actually a dual class citizenship structure, which is to say, if you are born in a rural area, you have a rural household registration. It's called a hoku. You are not allowed to just go live in Shenzhen, raise your family there, and have the benefits of certain welfare services. So you can go to Shenzhen for a time, but it needs to be to work. Your kids can't go to the local school or anything, and that's why a lot of kids in the West end up being raised by their grandparents. So you were just there to work for a few years and then go back. And this floating population is instrumental to Apple's rise because when you have a company like Foxconn doing the assembly, Foxconn will have 400,000 people at peak iPhone season assembling iPhones, but they don't need anywhere near that number just a few months later in March, right? And so Apple's able to sort of take advantage of this fluctuating demand for its products by using companies like Foxconn who can allocate workers from one product to another. They've got dozens and dozens of clients around the factory, and indeed the floating labor force can go from one town to a next, following as in a word seasonal demand for products. Not seasonal in the sense of autumn and summer, but seasonal production demand. The number of people in that population is 350 million, right? So what's that? 10 times the population of Canada? It's more than the population of America. We are not going to compete with that. There's this one line from a former manufacturing design engineer who's been quoted in the media recently saying, Zhengzhou, what Apple calls iPhone City in Zhengzhou, is the equivalent of Boston. Everyone in Boston giving up their day job to instead assemble iPhones. Like that's how big it is. And I go further than what this person said, which is it's like the city of Boston is assembling iPhones for a few weeks, and then everybody goes off to Milwaukee to assemble something else, and then they all go to New York for something else, and then they go to Milwaukee. So we're not going to compete with that. In addition to the things that you already know, American wages are far, far higher than Chinese wages. You've got lots of Chinese people that are happy, or at least not happy, but they're content to work 12-hour days in ways that you and I would not want to. The industrial policy of China lures in all sorts of foreign capital. It builds things at a rate that, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are dreaming about in their new book, Abundance, right? So there are just so many advantages that China has that we're just not going to compete with. That's why I say Mexico, something like NAFTA on steroids, that could potentially work. India could potentially work. But we're not getting close to the industrial clusters that China has anytime soon. And maybe I should just finish this by saying the epigraph to the book is a 2015 document from China that says, without manufacturing, there is no country, there is no nation. We do not think like that. We do not have a Nietzschean will to power based on manufacturing and tech engineering competence. China does. So it's like a grade seven kid in Toronto saying they're going to compete with LeBron James. Good luck.
I like that analogy. But once again, it comes back to the fact that this is what you can accomplish with an authoritarian government where the government never changes, right? In the West, we have these governments that come and go every 4 years, so you never have a continuity in terms of policy. So things never
I,
get done.
One thing I just want to jump on there is what I think people have appreciated about the book is I have quite a nuanced portrait of China. And I know that if someone sees the logo, the what the cover of the book, it's a dragon eating the apple, which I absolutely love. But they'll probably think the book is more anti-China than it is. And I have quite a nuanced portrait of China, and I give them a lot of kudos, so let's say, for sort of coming up with a form of capitalism that isn't based on Western textbooks and isn't just based on, authoritarian, like thou shalt do this. They really have this almost grassroots version of communism, where in Moscow it really was top down. In Beijing, it's like they call the shots with their 5-year plans, but then I quote a scholar calling it an RDA, a regionally decentralized authoritarian model. And what that means is that local cadres down to the municipal level get the directive, but it's in a sense, it's up to them how they're going to actually follow the directive. And so what you get is deep, deep competition between the industrial clusters of Suzhou versus Hangzhou versus Shenzhen versus Chengdu, because all of them are rewarded by bringing in capital and having factory growth in their cities. And so, when we talk about bureaucrats in the West, we're largely talking about people that stifle growth by highlighting environmental standards or, not letting you build here, there, anywhere for particular reasons, right? Causing roadblocks and stuff like that. In China, you have a form of bureaucracy that's more akin to a venture capitalist who sits on the board, who drives growth, and wants to see things go successfully. And so it really is this different form of capitalism that's quite different from Soviet communism and quite different from American capitalism. And again, just what people get from the book is a pretty nuanced portrait, and to some degree, a positive portrait or maybe let's just say the silver linings of a ruthless authoritarian state.
Well said. Okay, Patrick, I want to move on now and I want to talk about Taiwan because you can't have a discussion on China without talking about Taiwan. And in your book, there's a chapter called A Staggering Vulnerability, TSMC, which is Taiwan Semiconductor. It's one of the world's largest makers of advanced semiconductors. And in 2022, Apple moved away from Intel chips, which are made in the US, and it started designing its own chips, and it was using Taiwan Semi to make those in Taiwan. And herein lies another major risk for Apple. Maybe you can just expand on that.
So let me just push back on a couple things. In no sense do we need to sort of hide from the superlatives about TSMC. We don't need to say one of the biggest, or most advanced semiconductor makers in the world. They are by far the largest semiconductor manufacturer in the world. Their fabs are absolutely world leading. We're talking 80 to 90% market share. This is the only company that can fabricate the 3 nanometer chips that are going in the latest iPhones. The only real competitor there is Samsung, and Samsung's far, far behind. The story of semiconductors in general is a fascinating one where you went from at least a dozen cutting edge chip manufacturers maybe 2 decades ago to really just two today, with TSMC leading. By the way, the book that I very much based my own outline on is called Chip War by Chris Miller. And so if readers haven't read Chip War, I highly recommend they do so because learning all about semiconductors maybe sounds like it's a little bit boring until Miller convinces you within a matter of 3 to 4 pages that the whole modern world lives off of semiconductor technology, and who controls it is pretty key to who's going to control 21st century hegemony on the planet. Okay, the scary thing is that once you have an understanding of how important TSMC is, then you realize that beyond all the things I'm talking about, where 90% of iPhone production, 90% of Apple manufacturing is all based in China, every product that you can think of with an Apple logo on the outside has chips supplied by TSMC on one island, right? A rogue province from the eyes of Beijing. And Xi Jinping has said things like, this is not a problem we will leave for the next generation. I mean, he's full on pledged to annex Taiwan while he's in power, and he's in a third term right now. It's the equivalent of a meteor strike on Apple's business if that happens. And maybe I could just cite Warren Buffett here. Warren Buffett invested some $5 billion in TSMC a few years ago. And I think around 6 months later, he divested entirely from it. And basically, his explanation was, I love the company, love the management. I don't like the location, so I reconsidered. Apple is, or sorry, I should say this differently. Buffett's Buffett is the number one investor of Apple as well. And during the writing of my book, he divested 2/3 of his investment from Apple, which is to say that I think, because he hasn't spelled this out, I think he views Apple through the same prism that he views TSMC in, as he should. All the logic of his divestment from TSMC makes sense for Apple, and he has not given an alternate explanation.
There's one other quote in your book, or you actually quoted somebody. His name's Nicholas Kristof. I believe he's another journalist.
Yeah, he's a New York Times op-ed columnist. I know exactly what he said because it's an incredible statement, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, I'm going to read the statement. He said Taiwan Semiconductor is the only corporation who could cause a global depression. And so when you look at this statement, you realize how significant this company is and also how significant or how important the country of Taiwan is. And if something were to happen to that, it would have devastating consequences for so many companies, including Apple and Taiwan Semiconductor, Nvidia, so many others.
Yeah, I mean, Apple's more exposed than anyone else just because of how successful they are, right? So that's what makes them so vulnerable to China, that they are the most successful operator in China. They're also the most successful retail company in China in terms of the domestic demand. They've been TSMC's largest client since I think 2011. I mean, largely the degree to which TSMC has ousted all of its rivals is in part because Apple has been funding them billions upon billions of dollars to build all these fabs. And I've spent less time on this, but Apple has absolutely gone into the TSMC factories to help them on everything, right? You get brilliant people coming out of American universities that get sent over to TSMC to help build out that capacity. I'm only hesitant to say that because I don't want to take away from TSMC's cutting edge knowledge and everything that goes on in Taiwan, but they definitely get help from Apple as well.
So we spent some time talking about these two monumental risks, the way I look at it anyway, the Apple products being manufactured in China, and then the semiconductor chips or advanced semiconductor chips coming from Taiwan, Taiwan Semiconductor. Apple is down 20% on the year, and a lot of the weaknesses come from many of the issues that we already discussed, and also the possibility of this trade war going on between the US and China. Let me ask you this question. If you were a money manager and you were responsible for investing billions of dollars of other people's money, would you invest in Apple?
So I'm not going to totally dodge the question, but obviously I'm not an investor and I'm not comfortable answering the question. What I would say is I quote someone near the end of the book saying the relationship Apple enjoys with China could blow up at any time. Now, what's difficult about that if you're an investor is, well, what time? I mean, how do I put possible existential risk in my Excel sheet, right? I don't know that you can. And this risk has been there for at least 10 years. And so if you had discounted Apple because of that risk over the last 10 years, it would have been a losing strategy, right? I mean, timing is everything in investing. And so unless Patrick can tell you when the blow up is going to happen, I don't know how helpful it is to say that it could blow up. And it's not that it will, and we just don't know when. But it's the same thing with investing in TSMC. I mean, Taiwan, like the biggest risk about Taiwan is probably a political earthquake, meaning that Beijing tries to annex the country. But a real earthquake is the other big concern because it lies on, I'm forgetting what it's called, but it lies on the biggest, earthquake belt in the world. And any big tremor would immediately have problems for TSMC because if you recognize like the precision that they are dealing with, it's on a mind-blowing scale that I failed to comprehend despite having read a whole bunch of material about it. And so major tremors could seize TSMC production very, very quickly, if not throw them offline for months. Now, it's a very sophisticated company, but they don't have their operations of that size really anywhere else. So the geopolitical factors at play and the concentration of Apple's risk into Greater China really is stunning. But how that actually plays out for your portfolio strategy is way above my pay grade. I have no idea.
Dan Ives is a research analyst at Wedbush Securities, and he has said moving 10% of Apple's supply chain out of China would take at least 3 years and cost $30 billion. He also went on to say a full pivot out of China would take 5 to 10 years. Is Apple stuck in China?
Absolutely stuck in China. I know Dan. I don't know where he's getting these figures, and I don't think he's all that transparent with what math he is doing. I'm at least happy in a sense that he's using tens of billions of dollars as his benchmark. I mean, there's another firm, I think this is from TD Cowen, right? Like the investment arm of TD Securities, who has said, actually, no, I'm sorry, it might be Morgan Stanley. Their estimate was that oh gosh, now yeah, I guess I'm losing the thread on exactly what it is. But their estimate was, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment is what would be needed to make serious changes. So I guess like the distinction between tens of billions and hundreds of billions is actually massive, and yet they're both pointing to the same direction, which is just that this takes gargantuan investments. But I would say the geopolitical challenges of Beijing even allowing you to do this are probably bigger than the money involved. One thing that we haven't quite explained on the podcast that is necessary for the narrative is just the degree to which Apple is investing in China to get all of its products made there, right? The tech competence doesn't exist in the early 2000s. And so Apple makes these gargantuan investments. I mean, we talk about Apple having an influence on certain industries. Among the industries that it had massive influence on was on the airline industry, because on two different occasions, United started one-stop flights from San Francisco to two different Chinese cities just at the behest of Apple, because they said, we will purchase so many first class seats that even if the rest of the plane is empty, you'll still make a profit. And so Apple was sending just hundreds of people before an iPhone launch, year in, year out, to train up all these companies. So China doesn't want to lose Apple. I mean, Apple, to some extent, you could say, is actually pretty safe from a retaliatory move from Beijing, because Beijing understands the degree to which Apple plays the role of teacher to hundreds of factories across the country. And so they've built up considerable goodwill, political capital, if you will, that allows Apple to operate there without any real obstacles. The trouble is, Donald Trump doesn't want that to continue, and for reasons that are totally rational. New Delhi should be making more of a push to have that, and yet technology transfer is really important to China, and they want it to be a one-way gate. They want the information coming in, they don't want to see it depart to the shores of India. So that is more of a problem than how many billions of dollars it would cost to actually move stuff. At the end of the day, Apple has billions of dollars. Um, but that's not the winning strategy. That's not the silver bullet. It's less about dollars. It's more about the negotiations and the tactics. And I think Apple's sort of at a loss there. That's why they're stuck in China.
You touched on Warren Buffett a couple of times, mentioning that he sold his stake in both Taiwan Semiconductor and also a big chunk of Apple. He might be selling it right now as we speak. Who knows? But I got to read this quote that he mentioned during the 2025 Berkshire AGM. And the quote is, I'm somewhat embarrassed to say Tim Cook has made Berkshire a lot more money than I ever did. And I can't remember the number, but it's estimated it was like $150 billion of what he sold, and that includes capital gains and also dividends. So it's just a huge amount of money. But I got to ask you, has Warren Buffett or any other investors reached out to you since you published your book?
I won't comment on any specific investors, but lots of investors have reached out, and so I've spoken to many investors since the book came out. The only thing I would say in reaction to that quote is, look, Warren Buffett got to where he is because he's a very tactful negotiator as well. And so it makes sense to say really nice things about Tim Cook as you are divesting from the company, because otherwise there's going to be a lot more questions. I mean, if he's saying bad things about Apple as he divests, then that would be quite a poor move on his part. So, what's the common phrase? Follow the money. And so it's nice that he's saying good things, but what has he done with Apple shares over the last 2 years?
Valid point. Very valid point. And what about Apple? Have they commented on the book at all?
Apple, so I squeeze them out of the process in a way that I have to sort of spend a lot of time with journalists, defending myself from, because in journalism, that's not what you do. You always talk to a company, you give them 48 hours to respond, you give them 72 hours to respond. It's called the no surprise policy. And I'm a big advocate of it in journalism. This is not journalism. This was writing a book. I finished the first manuscript last September. The idea that between September and May, Apple could have all that time to build a counter narrative because I gave them bullet points of everything that was said in the book was just totally a non-starter. I mean, I just couldn't have done it. Apple's also just like deliberately unhelpful. Like, it's not like they're not helpful because of a matter of competence. It's that as a matter of strategy, they do not want to help you as a journalist. So the idea that they would be involved in fact checking or something, I just think would have been a ridiculous proposition. And especially if you understand just how sensitive the story is. I mean, what's the phrase? No one likes to know how the sausage gets made. Well, no one likes to know how the iPhone gets made. And among the things I have for this book, for instance, is more than 1,000 pages of internal documents that were released as a part of court discovery. I found them 17 months ago. They weren't discovered by another journalist. It includes things like Tim Cook's letter to the board of directors before an investment call, a deposition of Tim Cook, a deposition of the CFO, each lasting more than 2 hours. Internal competitive analysis of Huawei as a threat, internal memo on India as the next frontier, so many things. And to basically have the book published without anybody knowing that and then just revealing all of that at one was really I mean, a gold mine, first of all, just to find that as a journalist. But the alternative of giving a heads up 6 months in advance that I had all of that just would have been nonsense. So, Apple, on the one hand, has acknowledged that I did not seek any help from them in the manuscript and that they did not have a chance to read it. And yet, before it was published, they told Vanity Fair that it was, quote, wrong and, quote, full of inaccuracies. So, how they came to that conclusion without having read the book is a mystery to me, but they haven't made any further comment since.
Okay, so you've talked about Huawei numerous times, and you also talked about their operating system. Is it called Harmony?
Harmony OS, yeah.
Okay, so in 2007, when the first iPhone came out, at that time, BlackBerry was king of the hill. They dominated the cell phone industry.
They
And
dominated the smartphone industry. Nokia was much larger in terms of, having 900 million
yes,
phones. But yeah, if you were sort of like a hip kid, you definitely had what was called a crackberry at the time because they were so addictive.
and no one ever thought anybody was ever going to replace BlackBerry, but someone did, and that was the iPhone. And it didn't take too many years. Who's going to replace the iPhone?
That's a great question. I mean, in the news recently is that Johnny Ive, right, basically the designer of the iPhone, has teamed up with Sam Altman to do sort of AI first hardware. I hope I'm wrong about this. I don't know what that could possibly be that does a better job than a glowing 4 hour a day rectangle in your pocket. You know what I mean? Like Apple has such access to the cutting edge chips from TSMC that I don't know what you could do on a phone-like device that maybe doesn't have a screen that you couldn't then replicate within an app. In other words, even if the AI is full of great features, they're not going to be building them in hundreds of millions within the first year. So that if they have that technology, they would want to give it to potentially millions of users, and all of those users are going to have a smartphone. So the smartphone is very, very hard to displace. I don't see us using goggles anytime soon. Even if we do have goggles, it's going to be more like the Apple Watch, where it augments what the smartphone does. The glowing 4 hour a day rectangle in your pocket is just hard to displace. So it's more likely that they would just face steeper competition from Chinese companies that are out innovating Apple on not just manufacturing, but on industrial design, on product design, on manufacturing design, and can sell them at a cheaper price. I would foresee Apple's market share in China going back to single digits by 2030. And then the question is, to what extent can the Chinese begin to dominate other markets? They're probably not going to dominate the American market anytime soon, but God knows what's going to happen in, India, where Apple only has 5% market share, or Southeast Asia, or any number of countries in Europe and Africa.
Yes, and one of the things that took BlackBerry down was their inability to incorporate apps into their phone. And this is one thing that really set Apple off like a rocket ship was their ability to work with what do you call those people that create apps?
Developers?
Developers, right? And they just incorporated hundreds and thousands of different apps into the phone.
Yeah, and not only that, but if you've had an iPhone in the last 10 or 15 years, that means you've got 10 to 15 years of photos of your family, of, everything like your passwords, that are all stored there. I mean, it is not a fun weekend to go from iPhone to Android, or indeed from Android to iPhone. So the lock-in that Apple has on its customers, and there's what, 1.5 billion iPhone users? I can't think of the precise number. It might be lower than that. Is really tremendous. And so it really does take something absolutely phenomenal for people to get rid of their iPhones. So I don't see them as precarious as BlackBerry, which really did sort of shut down in a matter of 5, 6 years. Um, but it is obvious to a lot of people that Apple is no longer leading the cutting edge. I mean, at this point, a Microsoft presentation is more enticing than an Apple one. I mean, nobody in their right mind would have said that even 4 years ago, let alone 10, 20, 30 years ago. Apple's always been the sexier company, but the way that they're demonstrating AI embedded into their products is ridiculously impressive. And the only time Apple really tried to replicate that a year ago at WWDC, it turned out to be vaporware essentially, and they had to walk it back and cancel the advertisements that were just demonstrating the capabilities. That's pretty stunning. And I'm saying Microsoft, I mean, OpenAI and ChatGPT, I mean, that's even more impressive. Google Gemini is more impressive. So you don't have to be a critic of Apple. Look, I love Apple products. I'm talking to you on Apple products. Um, But yeah, and I would say things like, the iPhone is still a world-leading iPhone. The MacBook Air that I have is probably the best money per dollar that you could spend on a great laptop. But they are not in the top five when it comes to AI features. And AI is very much the future. I mean, that seems as clear to everybody as what else is competitive with AI with world-leading breakthrough features at the moment? I mean, nothing. And that's probably the story for the next 10 years at least.
Well, this was a fascinating discussion, Patrick. And as we wrap up, I have one more question, and I want to ask
Yeah.
you, when you were writing the book, what surprised you or what shocked you the most about Apple?
Well, in a sense, the broadest narrative is that Apple didn't get stuck on competencies it discovered in China. It got stuck on the dependencies it created there. And the nation building like influence that Apple had on China was so hard for me to digest. It took months of really processing it, where in my mind, I started comparing Apple's impact on China to the Marshall Plan. And that sounded like it sounded like an unhinged statement. The reason I went there is because I could find no corporate equivalent to what Apple discovered it was investing in China when they did their own supply chain study in 2015. They were investing $55 billion a year into Chinese factory. Okay, that's one CHIPS Act per year in America's greatest adversarial nation. And so that took me a long time to really understand. And every day I got a manufacturing design engineer on the phone and said, "Did Apple really have this kind of influence?" Even though, after a dozen people said that's absolutely the kind of influence we had, we were training millions of workers. I still expected somebody to push back and find the flaw in my logic or the flaw in the investment number or whatever, and it just never happened. And that's when I realized that Apple's influence, how do you have one super corporation have an influence on a country like 1.4 billion people that is comparable to the US government at the height of its power at the end of World War II on 16 countries? But if you do the math, convert to 2015 dollars, Apple's investments in China are more than double that of the Marshall Plan, and not in 16 countries, but in one, and not in agriculture and food aid and a host of other things, but in the high-tech electronic sector exclusively. I mean, that's when I began to realize there isn't just a good book in this. There's a superb book. Like, how many corporate histories do you have, James, that get into geopolitical nation building territory? There aren't any. That shocked the hell out of me.
So I guess that leads me to one more question. What's your next book going to be on?
Oh my God, this is the cause of sleepless nights. No, I shouldn't say that. I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing next. I don't know that I'm willing to say goodbye to the Apple story. If we talked in January, I would have said absolutely, I'm good to say goodbye. But it's such a dynamic live story. I'm insatiably curious to figure out or to find out, just to watch, to observe, to report on if they can pull it off in India. Can they do something that is above my pay grade as a journalist to see, right? I'm not a supply chain expert. I don't see how they get out of China, but there's a lot of geniuses at Apple. If someone can do it, it's Apple. So I would love to see how they do that. I would love to see how they play out the next 1100 or whatever days it is with vice president. So we'll see. I don't know if I'm widening the aperture on what I'm interested in. So going from beyond Apple to look at, national security, manufacturing policy, and technology competition, or should I look at something entirely different and leave Apple to somebody else? I don't know. I need to figure that out.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to speak with you because the ramifications associated with Apple being the largest company in the world, one of the most successful companies in the world. It has huge implications for investors all over the world. And I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts today. And I would highly recommend to our viewers to check this book out. I'm going to have a link below in the show notes. It's a great read. And Patrick, if anybody would like to follow you online and learn more about you and see your thoughts, where can they go?
Best place to go is appleinchina.com.
Patrick, once again, thank you.
Cheers, James. Thank you.
Look forward to the next book.
Thank you.